Hello and welcome to MBTV. My name is Damon and I prefer ENTJ. Today I'm going to share with you the cognitive function of introverted thinking and the many facets that make up what it is. Well-developed individuals will generally make more informative judgments by incorporating both aspects of feeling and thinking into their decision-making processes. However, today we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on what introverted thinking is and what it is not. The thinking function, in general, both introverted and extroverted, makes impersonal, non-human judgments. Those who overuse it and prefer it over feeling have the tendency to put human information into logical elements in order to make an effective decision. Another word for the thinking function is logic, which is the term used by Socionics, and I've been using it myself as of late. The primary reason I've chosen this word over the former is because many people believe they prefer thinking, simply because they prefer to think over feeling emotional. This obviously isn't anywhere near the truth or accurate about what cognitive functions are, but the semantics can certainly imply that. The thinking function is actually a process we use to come to decisions and closure. In contrast to feeling, thinking is not really concerned with conveying feelings, expressions, and moods. Instead, it is concerned with the consistency of objects, things, and actions. In other words, what is correct and what is not correct. Right and wrong, pros and cons, that type of thing. So the function of thinking can adopt one of two attitudes, one which is pressed into consciousness, and the other one which is less preferred to the point of moving into unconsciousness, or kind of like working in the shadow or the background. These attitudes are of the introverted or extroverted nature. When people think of the word thinking, they are often referring to introverted thinking. Introverted thinking is the process in which one weighs information against a framework pre-established by the thinker as true. Introverted thinking, also known as TI, uses taxonomies to validate information or to refine its existing models. For example, if one who prefers introverted thinking believes evolution is true, they will seek to make sure that every piece of information they come across fits into their current understanding of that model. If the information does not fit that model, they may analyze that piece of information to see how it can fit. If it doesn't, either the information is seen as false or the theory itself is revised. And it really just depends on the weight of the fact in itself. This contrasts extroverted thinking, where the incoming information isn't primarily weighed against the subject's understanding of the model of evolution, but rather it is judged for its usefulness and applicability in the real world. If it has the desired effect and it proves useful, then the fact can exist as truth outside of the model for which it was designed. For this particular reason, I prefer to call this function that of the logical analyzer, that is, introverted thinking. But the analysis primarily happens inside the subject's mind. As you can see, a contrast between the argumentation styles of the introverted and extroverted thinker. Extroverted thinking primarily notices logical inconsistencies with the information presented in itself, outside of self. On the other hand, introverted thinking is taking each fragment of the argumentation and weighing it against some internal system to test it for validity. If the introverted thinker has not come across some point or some type of reference index in which to weigh the information, they may find themselves ill-equipped to handle an argument on a logical level. Because of this, they can generally discover flaws in argumentation by researching and studying argumentation in itself and argumentation fallacies, without even particularly knowing the subject being discussed, thereby having universal logical discernment. On the other hand, the extroverted thinker generally notices logical inconsistencies within the external context without referring to some type of framework of argumentation, fallacies, or any argumentation in general. In other words, the introverted thinker at young ages without decent exposure to theoretical models may struggle presenting logical arguments in areas that which they are not familiar. To simplify the understanding of what introverted thinking is, simply think of the subjective experience in life, or taking a subjective perspective in life, taking the underlying structures of what happens and making logical sense of it all. Unlike introverted intuition, introverted thinking tends to label, fit, categorize, and systematically organize information into frameworks that can be referred to at later times. Subjective experience is key, and that experience can be gained through understanding others' experiences as well. To portray a more accurate picture of what this looks like, you can imagine what a car needs to run. The basics that are it needs an engine and a transmission, and then wheels to move. This knowledge is gained through your own experience with cars, your own observations, someone teaching you, or a manual that you've read in the past or you have in front of you. Either way, you've learned this through some kind of subjective experience. Now let's say that the car stops working for whatever reason. So the introverted thinker may run through a series of checkpoints to understand what's going on, and those checkpoints would be more complex based on their own understanding of how a car works. So for someone who has a basic understanding, the first question may be, is the engine operating? If it is, then it might be the transmission. If the transmission is operating, then it might be the fact that the car doesn't have wheels. As you can see, the thinker is following some type of framework of how a car actually works, based on what they know, and less on their direct observation. After all these checkpoints have been cross-referenced and the problem is not yet solved, the introverted thinker may seek to fill the holes in this particular missing framework until they discover the solution to the problem. They may find themselves asking questions like, what other components are there to make a car run? Soon enough that they find that where the area in which they didn't know, that there was a starter that wasn't turning or a solenoid that wasn't engaging to actually start the engine. Or it was a differential to take the power from the transmission into the wheels. It could have been a number of components that they were unaware of in this framework. Although this is a very simple example and more along the lines of how an ISTP would use introverted thinking in their cognitive process, it does demonstrate the consistent and preferential problem-solving method of introverted thinking, not to exclude that extroverted thinkers also use this as well. Extroverted thinking, on the other hand, may not refer to any model at all though, and recognize that A component must lead to B component and B must lead to C in order for that to work, because it's the only way that would make sense. Therefore, the problem must be D because D isn't receiving any power from A, B, or C. As you can see, both types can effectively solve the issue or completely fail to solve the issue. It doesn't really matter there. But one takes a preference over the other, depending on who is using the thinking. So what you can gain from this particular example is that introverted thinking sees facts such as the engine, the transmission, and the wheels, and the differential, or the starter, or the solenoid as illustrative proofs of the model that they've learned throughout their subjective and own experience, or their subjective experience. This is called subjectivity in Jungian psychology. On the other hand, you can see that the objective power of extroverted thinking doesn't really rely on models. It may use models for its scope, but it doesn't really rely on it. So one very powerful advantage of introverted thinking is that understanding the experience of others and further refining upon them is actually adding to a framework and a wealth of information, observation, and always seeking the classifying criteria to build upon their existing models. Extroverted thinking does not have this type of depth of categorization power. Instead, it relies on what is observable, general principles, and generalized conclusions. As I've stated before, it's really narrow and deep versus broad and expansive. One of the objectives of introverted thinking is to completely detach from logical data so that the information can be scrutinized and categorized effectively without injecting subjective biases. This is the biggest mix-up when people think of introverted thinking. People who prefer introverted thinking have the gift of total detachment, as other types, even extroverted thinkers, may have a difficult time doing this at all. To summarize really what introverted thinking is, it relies on underlying principles and frameworks. Those who prefer it as their dominant or auxiliary function may find an obsession to getting to the bottom of theories, frameworks, or ideas. They want to understand everything there is to know about a particular principle or framework, seeking to further classify its many components, or even better yet, relate it to the principles and frameworks in which they believe to be true or they've already established. Many people who enjoy MBTI use introverted thinking in the typing of their friends and other people, using their particular understanding of the models and behaviors to identify that, or the behaviors that identify with a particular type. They rely on this more than anything else to determine someone's type. Whereas extroverted thinking may actually struggle on its own identifying type simply because it's not directly observable. Instead, they will create questionnaires and metrics to help give them some kind of empirical evidence to type, hence the Myers-Briggs instrument. Then, when there is an inconsistency with what is observed and what is reported, they may call quick attention to that inconsistency, attempting to make some kind of resolution for it, as extroverted thinking cannot stand external inconsistency. Introverted thinking also plays a very large role in the study of morality, human ethics, cultures, and customs. In other words, it is highly connected to the functionality of extroverted feeling. Those who prefer the FJ temperament, such as SFJs and NFJs, use their introverted thinking to make sense of the customs that are needed in current society. Oftentimes, you will find the study of philosophy highly interesting to these types because of the logical reasoning behind the codes of ethics or human values, and should they or should they not incorporate these values. In the EFJ types, of course, they may overlook their own understanding of principles based on moral convictions that they may not be able to yet explain or justify, but effectiveness in the environment. In those who prefer the TP personality, introverted thinking comes out in a much more observable manner. It can appear like a heavily researched person referring to principles and spending many hours diving deep into those principles. Again, that is because this is their primary judging method through life. It's their primary approach to life. And this judgment is done, of course, internally and not externally. So externally, they may actually look kind of disorganized. Of course, this was a very, very basic introduction to what actually introverted thinking is. The facets of introverted thinking can go much, much deeper, and in the future, we will go into this. So hopefully this content brought you a little more light on the rather sophisticated cognitive function of introverted thinking. If you like this content, don't forget to subscribe below and join our mailing list for future updates and more releases and more in-depth studies on cognitive functions. You can join our mailing list at mbtvcoach.com. And I appreciate it, and thank you so much again for watching this video, and we'll see you next time. Sometimes at the cost of logic being internally consistent. What may make perfect sense in the mind may not actually work in external reality. So in a sense, we can call introverted logic proof logic and extroverted logic practical logic. Extroverted thinking, also known as TE, uses its process to determine how well an object, thing, or system is performing, the side effects of that performance, and the observable result it attains. It measures this up against external standards and